Her freedom was being auctioned away, a life growing inside her, just another commodity on the block. But in the crowd stood a man with nothing left to lose, a dying rancher about to spend his very last dollar on a future that wasn't his own. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the splintered wood of the platform, on the sweat-slicked faces in the crowd, on the dust that rose in lazy, choking clouds with every shuffle of a boot. For Sarah, the heat was an internal thing, a fever that had little to do with the weather. It was the fire of humiliation, stoked by the auctioneer's voice as it picked apart her value like a butcher dissecting a carcass. "Strong back," the voice boomed, a caricature of salesmanship that turned her spine to ice. "Good for field work, good for the house. And you see here," he said, his hand making a vulgar gesture toward her swollen abdomen, "a bonus, 2 for the price of 1. A smattering of coarse laughter rippled through the assembled men. Each chuckle was a stone thrown, and she was already drowning. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose nail in the floorboards, a tiny, insignificant point of focus in a world that had become impossibly vast and hostile. She could feel their eyes on her, stripping her down past the thin cotton of her dress, past her skin, past the very bones that held her upright. They were assessing livestock, a mare, a heifer, a girl. The lines blurred under the relentless sun. Her hands, bound loosely in front of her, trembled not with fear, but with a rage so profound it had no sound. It was a silent, vibrating current that sang through her blood, a song only she and the child nestled deep within her could hear. It was a promise of survival, a vow whispered into the void. They could sell her body, but they could not purchase the core of her, the unquenchable flicker of defiance that she guarded like a precious coal. The bidding started, a casual volley of numbers that represented years of her life, of her child's life. $10, 15. The numbers were meaningless and everything all at once. They were the cold arithmetic of despair. And then, a different kind of silence fell. It wasn't the expectant pause of the auctioneer. It was a shift in the air itself, a change in atmospheric pressure. A voice, rough as granite and dry as the dust, cut through the noise. 50. It wasn't a bid, it was a declaration. A full stop at the end of a sentence she hadn't known was being written. Heads turned. Sarah, against her will, lifted her gaze from the nail. She saw him then, standing at the edge of the crowd, slightly apart from the others. He was an old man, weathered and gaunt, his clothes worn but clean. He leaned on a sturdy walking stick, and even from a distance she could hear the faint, wet rattle in his chest when he drew a breath. His eyes, pale blue and startling in his sun-scorched face, were not fixed on her body, not on her belly. They were fixed on her face. He wasn't assessing. He was seeing. The auctioneer, momentarily stunned, recovered with a greasy smile. $50 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 55? Silence. The men murmured, looking from the strange, solitary rancher to the girl on the block. $50 was a steep price, an investment with a questionable return. The auctioneer's call grew more desperate. 50, going once, going twice. The rancher's gaze never wavered. It was a heavy, unreadable thing, a weight that was somehow different from the crushing burden of the others. It wasn't ownership it conveyed. It was something else, something she couldn't yet name. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking against the lectern like a gunshot. "To the dying man with the deep pockets." The laughter this time was quieter, laced with a new thread of unease. Sarah's world tilted, the nail on the floor blurring as the man started to walk forward, his steps slow and deliberate, each one echoing the unsteady beat of her own heart. The transaction was a cold, quiet affair, a stark contrast to the performative noise of the auction. Money, a small, worn leather pouch of it, exchanged hands. The rancher, whose name she would later learn was Elias, counted out the coins with a slow, deliberate precision, his knuckles white. There was a finality to the clink of metal on the auctioneer's table, the sound of a closing door. He didn't look at Sarah as he did it. He looked at the paper the auctioneer slid toward him, a bill of sale that felt more like a death certificate. He signed it with a hand that trembled, not from age, but from a deep, racking cough that shook his entire frame. He turned away from the table, his breath coming in ragged, painful rasps, and finally he looked at her. He gave a short, sharp nod toward the rope that bound her wrists. The auctioneer's assistant, a boy no older than 16 with vacant eyes, moved forward and cut the cord. The sudden freedom in her hands was a shock, the blood rushing back with a painful tingle. She rubbed her wrists, the raw red lines a map of her immediate past. Elias said nothing. He simply turned and began to walk away, his walking stick thumping a steady rhythmic beat against the hard-packed earth. He didn't look back to see if she was following. The expectation was absolute, a silent command more powerful than any chain. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, the sun beating down, the murmuring crowd a hostile sea around her small island of uncertainty. This was it, the pivot, the moment her life swerved onto a new, unknown path. Was it a better one, or just a different stretch of the same road to hell? The man was a specter, a ghost with a rattling chest and eyes that held the vast, lonely emptiness of the plains. He was her owner now. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. With a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm the frantic fluttering in her own chest, she took the first step, and then another. She fell into pace behind him, keeping a careful distance, her senses screaming. The walk through the dusty remains of the town was a gauntlet of whispers and stares. Women peered from behind curtains, their faces pinched with disdain. Men on porches stopped their conversations, their eyes lingering on her belly, their expressions a mixture of contempt and morbid curiosity. They saw a rich man's folly, a dying man's strange last purchase. They saw a piece of property being led away. They did not see a woman. They did not see a mother. Elias seemed oblivious to it all, his focus singular, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he were steering a ship through treacherous waters. He walked past the saloon, past the general store, past the church with its stark white steeple pointing an accusatory finger at the sky. He walked until the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through dry grass and the cry of a hawk circling overhead. A lone wagon and two weary-looking horses stood tethered to a post at the edge of town. He didn't help her up. He simply climbed onto the driver's seat, the effort sending another tremor of coughs through him, and waited. Sarah hesitated, her hand on the rough wood of the wagon bed. She looked back the way they had come. There was nothing there for her. There was nothing ahead either, nothing but this man and the crushing, silent weight of the unknown. She pulled herself up, her movements clumsy with exhaustion and the awkwardness of her pregnancy, and settled onto the hard plank seat, as far from him as she could get. The wagon lurched forward, and the town disappeared behind them. The journey was carved out of silence, a thick, suffocating silence broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels, the soft thud of the horse's hooves, and the persistent, wet rattle in Elias's chest. He never spoke. He drove the team with a quiet, efficient focus, his eyes scanning the endless rolling expanse of dry earth and pale grass that stretched out before them. The landscape was a canvas of muted browns and faded greens, a world bleached by a relentless sun. It was vast and empty, and Sarah felt her own smallness within it. She felt like a single discarded seed thrown into a barren field. At first, her mind was a hornet's nest of fear. Every time he shifted his weight, every time his breath caught in a prelude to another coughing fit, she tensed, her muscles coiling, ready to fight, to flee. Where was he taking her? To what new form of prison? The questions circled and circled, vultures in the sky of her mind. But there were no answers to be found in his stony profile. He was as unreadable as the harsh, unforgiving land they traveled through. As the hours wore on, a different kind of feeling began to seep in, creeping over the sharp edges of her terror. It was a profound, bone-deep weariness. The constant vigilance was exhausting. The fear was a heavy cloak, and she was beginning to buckle under its weight. She watched him, studying him with a wary, covert intensity. She saw the way his hands, gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor, trembled slightly on the reins. She saw the sheen of sweat on his brow that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth, lines carved not just by sun and wind, but by a pain that seemed to radiate from deep within him. He was a man locked in a battle with his own body, and it was a battle he was clearly losing. Once, he was seized by a coughing fit, so violent the wagon shuddered to a halt. He doubled over, his body convulsing, and when he finally straightened, he spat a dark crimson stain into the dust. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and didn't look at her, as if ashamed of the weakness, of the blatant evidence of his own mortality. In that moment, a crack appeared in her fear. It wasn't pity she felt. Pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was a flicker of something else, a strange, unsettling recognition. She knew what it was to have a body that betrayed you, that was beyond your control. Her own body was swelling, changing, creating a life that would be born into this same brutal world. His frailty didn't make him less of a threat, not yet, but it made him human. It made him breakable. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he finally pulled the wagon to a stop near a small, gurgling creek. He climbed down, his movements stiff and slow, and tended to the horses, giving them water and feed. He then took a canteen and a small bundle wrapped in cloth and set it on the ground between them, a clear but unspoken invitation. He sat on a rock, his back to her, and ate his portion of dry bread and salted meat in silence, staring into the fading light. Sarah didn't move for a long time. Hunger gnawed at her, a dull ache that echoed the deeper ache of her uncertainty. Finally, cautiously, she slid from the wagon, her feet sinking into the cool, damp earth near the creek. She knelt and drank deeply from the water, the coldness a balm to her parched throat. Then she opened the bundle. Bread, meat, an apple, simple sustenance, offered without a word, without a demand. It was the first act of something that wasn't cruelty she had received in a very, very long time. She ate, the simple food tasting miraculous, and for the first time she allowed a single dangerous thought to take root. Maybe, just maybe, this cage would be different from the last. The ranch, when they finally arrived late the next day, was not what she had expected. There was no grand house, no bustling stables, no sign of wealth or prosperity. Instead, what greeted them was a portrait of quiet decay. The homestead was a small, unpainted wooden cabin, its roofline sagging slightly in the middle like a tired old man's shoulders. A crooked porch listed to one side, and the barn, a larger but equally weathered structure, had a few planks missing from its wall, creating dark, gaping wounds. The fences were mended in a dozen different places, a patchwork of old and new wood that spoke of a long, losing battle against time and the elements. This was not the domain of a powerful man. It was the last stand of a forgotten one. Elias brought the wagon to a halt in the dusty yard and sat for a moment, just breathing the air of the place. It was a deep, rattling breath, but it held a different quality here, a sound of homecoming. He climbed down and, without a word, began to unhitch the weary horses. Sarah remained seated on the wagon, her eyes taking in the scene. The loneliness of the place was a physical presence. It clung to the dry weeds that choked the yard, to the silent staring windows of the cabin, to the vast, empty sky that stretched to an unbroken horizon in every direction. It was a profound and desolate isolation. This, she thought, was not just a new cage. It was a tomb. Elias led the horses toward the barn, his steps slow but steady. After a moment, Sarah slid down from the wagon, her body stiff and sore from the journey. She stood in the middle of the yard, a solitary figure in a sea of dust and silence, and felt a wave of despair so potent it nearly brought her to her knees. She had been bought by a ghost and brought to his graveyard. He emerged from the barn after a few minutes and walked toward the cabin. He pushed open the creaking door and then turned, looking at her across the yard. He simply held the door open, waiting. It was another silent command, but this time it felt less like an order and more like a simple, tired statement of fact. This is where we are. Come. She crossed the yard, each step a conscious effort of will, and mounted the rickety porch steps. The inside of the cabin was dark and Spartan. It consisted of a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, its blankets thin and worn. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, the faint medicinal scent of sickness. Elias gestured with his head toward a small door in the far wall. "In there," he rasped, his voice raw. Sarah pushed the door open. It led to a small, windowless storage room, barely large enough for the narrow straw mattress that lay on the floor. It was little more than a closet, but it was a space, a separate space. He placed a bucket of fresh water and a tin cup just inside the doorway, then pulled the main cabin door closed, leaving her in the near darkness of her new room. The latch didn't click. There was no lock. She stood there for a long time, listening to the sounds of him moving about in the main room, the weary shuffle of his boots, another wrenching series of coughs. It wasn't a prison cell. There was no key turned, no bolt slid into place. But as she sank down onto the rustling straw, the profound, crushing weight of the silence and the emptiness of this place wrapped around her like a shroud. Freedom, she was beginning to understand, had many different faces, and some of them looked a lot like abandonment. Elias sat at the rough-hewn table, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows across his face, making the hollows of his cheeks seem even deeper. He stared at the closed door of the small room where the girl now was, but he wasn't seeing the wood or the iron latch. He was seeing another door, in another house, a lifetime ago. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass under the skin, rose up. It was the scent of rain on dry earth that brought it back, the same scent that had hung in the air the day he'd buried them. His wife, Maria, her laughter as bright and warm as the sunflowers she used to plant by the porch. His son, Daniel, a boy of 6 with his mother's dark eyes and a spirit as wild and untamable as a Mustang colt. The flashback was vivid, a cruel trick of a dying man's mind. He saw the fever, the relentless burning heat that had stolen the light from their eyes. He saw the town doctor, a man of platitudes and useless potions, shaking his head with a sigh of professional sympathy. He remembered the helplessness, a rage so profound it had left him silent and hollow for a year after. He had failed them. He had been strong, healthy, a man who could tame the land and bend it to his will, but he couldn't fight the sickness that had crept into his home like a thief in the night. After they were gone, the ranch had become his penance. He worked from sunup to sundown, punishing his body, seeking exhaustion as a way to numb the ache in his soul. The land, once a source of pride and promise, became his tormentor and his only companion. He had pushed everyone away, his grief a wall no one could scale. Now his own body was failing him. The same relentless thief that had taken his family was now pillaging his own lungs, one ragged breath at a time. The doctor in the town, a new man with the same useless sympathy, had given him a few months. A season, maybe. The diagnosis was a release. It was permission to stop fighting. He had gone to town that day to settle his meager affairs, to buy a few last supplies. He hadn't intended to go to the auction, but the sound of it, the ugly, boisterous sound of human beings being bought and sold, had drawn him in. He had stood at the back, a spectator to the casual cruelty, and then he saw her. He saw the girl on the platform, her face a mask of defiant stillness, her hands bound, and he saw her belly. In that moment, she was not property. She was not a slave. She was a vessel of a future he had been denied. The sight of her, pregnant and proud despite her circumstances, had lanced the hardened scab of his own loss. It wasn't a noble impulse that made him bid. It was something more selfish, more complex. It was a desperate, grasping attempt at redemption, a way to cheat the legacy of failure that haunted him. He couldn't save his own child, his own wife, but maybe, just maybe, he could purchase a chance for this one. It was a fool's bargain, a dying man's last, desperate bet. He had sold off the last of his healthy cattle, scraped together every last coin he possessed. It wasn't an investment in a laborer. It was a payment for a debt only he knew he owed. He looked at his trembling hands in the lamplight. He had bought a life. 2 lives. What in God's name was he supposed to do with them now? The cough rattled him again, a deep, tearing sound that echoed in the silent cabin. He was buying a future, but he had no part in it. He was just the broker, the ghost who paid the fee before fading away. The days fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Elias would rise before the sun, the sound of his hacking cough the day's first reluctant greeting. He would move with a pained slowness, tending to the two old horses, milking the single bony cow, his energy a shallow well that was quickly depleted. Sarah would emerge from her small room as the first light touched the dusty floorboards, her own movements slow and deliberate. At first she did nothing but watch, a wary sentinel perched on the edge of this new, desolate life. She watched him mend the fence, his hands shaking as he wrapped the wire. She watched him chop wood, pausing every few swings to lean on the axe handle, his breath catching in his throat. He never asked for her help, he never demanded anything of her at all. He simply left a portion of food on the table for her, a bowl of thin porridge in the morning, bread and cheese at midday, and went about his slow, painful work. The silence between them was a living thing, a vast, empty space they both navigated with caution. But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. It started with a bucket. She saw him struggling to carry 2 buckets of water from the well, his face pale with exertion. The next morning when he went to the well, 1 bucket was already full, sitting on the porch. He stopped, looked at the bucket, then looked at her standing in the cabin doorway. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, and that was all. It was a negotiation conducted without a single word. Soon she was tending the small, struggling vegetable garden behind the cabin, her hands, surprisingly gentle, coaxing life from the dry, reluctant soil. She took over the milking of the cow, her touch more patient than his. She learned the geography of the small cabin, the creak of each floorboard, the way the late afternoon sun streamed through the one clean patch on the window pane. They began to eat their meals at the same table, still in silence, but the space between them felt less like a chasm and more like a respectful distance. She started to see the man beneath the illness. She saw the pride that made him push his body past its limits, the deep, ingrained knowledge of the land in the way he studied the sky for rain. He, in turn, began to see her. He saw the fierce resilience in her eyes, the quiet strength in the way she carried herself, the protective way her hand would often rest on her swollen belly. One evening, a sudden, cold storm blew in, the wind howling around the cabin like a hungry wolf. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers. Elias, caught in a coughing fit, was too weak to fetch more wood from the porch. Without a thought, Sarah stood up, pulled her thin shawl tighter, and braced herself against the wind as she went outside. She returned with an armload of wood, her face wet with rain, and carefully rebuilt the fire. As the flames caught, casting a warm, dancing light across the room, he spoke, his voice a low rasp. "Thank you." 2 words. It was the first time he had spoken to her about anything other than a simple instruction. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a master, not an owner, but a lonely, dying man. She simply nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. In the shared warmth of the fire, surrounded by the storm's fury, the foundation of their strange, silent contract began to transform into something else entirely, something neither of them could have predicted or named. The knock on the door came on a blistering hot afternoon, a sharp, arrogant sound that shattered the cabin's fragile peace. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a lost traveler, it was a summons. Elias, who had been resting in his chair by the hearth, pushed himself slowly to his feet, a flicker of something hard and ancient in his pale eyes. Sarah, who was kneading dough at the table, froze, her hands covered in flour. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. She knew that knock. It was the sound of the outside world, the world that had sold her, the world that had forgotten her, now remembering her existence. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief, steadying touch. "Stay here," he rasped, his voice low but firm. He walked to the door and pulled it open. Standing on the porch, silhouetted against the harsh sunlight, was the town sheriff, a burly man with a florid face and a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest. Beside him stood another man, slighter in build, with a cruel, thin-lipped smile she recognized instantly. It was Mr. Gable, the man who had sold her to the auctioneer, her previous owner. "Elias," the sheriff began, his tone a mix of false bonhomie and officialdom. "Folks in town are talking, saying you're holed up out here with this acquisition. Mr. Gable here has some concerns, a vested interest, you might say." Gable stepped forward, his eyes darting past Elias to fix on Sarah. "I heard you paid a pretty penny for her, old man," he sneered, his gaze lingering on her belly. "But a deal's a deal. I'm just here to make sure my former property is being properly managed. Wouldn't want her getting any ideas." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Ideas of freedom, ideas of personhood. Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't have the breath for it, but his presence seemed to grow, to fill the doorway. "She is on my land," he said, each word costing him, each word a piece of flint, "and you are not welcome on it." The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Now, Elias, there's no need for trouble. There are laws, procedures. A woman like that in her condition, she's a flight risk. She belongs under lock and key, not playing house." "She is not a prisoner here," Elias stated, his voice quiet but unyielding. He took a half-step back, positioning his frail body more fully in the doorway. "A human shield." Gable laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Not a prisoner? What else would she be? You think that $50 bought her a holiday? I'm thinking I sold her too cheap. Maybe I ought to rectify that." He took a step toward the porch. In that moment, something inside Elias broke free from the cage of his dying body. A fire, banked for decades, flared in his eyes. He raised his walking stick, the heavy oak suddenly looking less like a support and more like a weapon. "You take one more step," he wheezed, the effort bringing on a deep, rattling cough, "and I will split your head open with this stick, sheriff or no sheriff. Get off my land." The sheer, unexpected ferocity of it stunned both men into silence. They saw not a frail, dying rancher, but a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. The sheriff, a bully at heart, was not prepared for a fight he might not win, especially one with no profit in it for him. He held up a placating hand. "All right, Elias, all right. Calm yourself. We'll leave you be, for now." He shot a frustrated look at Gable and jerked his head, indicating a retreat. They backed away from the porch, their boots crunching in the dust, and mounted their horses. As they rode away, Gable shouted back, "This ain't over, old man. She's property. You can't change that." Elias stood watching them until they were just a shimmer in the heat haze. Then, the strength seemed to drain out of him all at once. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his body racked with a series of deep, painful coughs that left him breathless and trembling. Sarah rushed to his side, helping him back to his chair. He sank into it, his eyes closed, his face ashen. She looked from his collapsed form to the empty doorway, to the hostile world that had just been held at bay. For the first time, she understood. He hadn't just bought her. He was protecting her. And in that moment, the last of her fear of him dissolved, replaced by a fierce, terrifying, and unfamiliar surge of loyalty. The confrontation with the sheriff and Gable had taken a heavy toll. Elias seemed to shrink in the days that followed. The last of his reserves burned away in that final, defiant stand. He no longer went out to mend fences or tend to the animals. His world had contracted to the small cabin, to the chair by the hearth, and then finally to the simple cot against the wall. The sound of his breathing became the constant, laboring rhythm of the house. Sarah was his caretaker now, the reversal of roles absolute and unspoken. She brought him water, spooned broth into his mouth, and sat with him through the long, rattling nights. The silence between them had changed again. It was no longer a space of caution or quiet understanding. It was now filled with the profound intimacy of shared vulnerability. One evening, as the sun bled its last colors across the sky, he called to her, his voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, the box." He gestured with a weak, trembling hand toward a small, locked wooden chest under his cot. "The key is on the nail by the door." She retrieved the small, rusted key and knelt by his bedside. She unlocked the chest. Inside, nestled amongst a few faded photographs and a small, worn Bible, were 2 folded documents. "Bring them," he whispered. She handed them to him, her heart suddenly pounding with a nameless dread and a sliver of impossible hope. With tremendous effort, he unfolded the first paper. It was the bill of sale from the auction, the stark, brutal contract that declared her his property. He held it out to her. "Take it." She took the paper, her fingers trembling. He then unfolded the second document. It was heavier, more official, covered in elegant script and bearing a notary's seal. He held it up for her to see. "Manumission," he breathed, the word a struggle. "Freedom." Sarah stared at the paper, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. I, Elias Thorne, do hereby and forever grant freedom to the woman known as Sarah. It was all there, legal, binding, dated the very same day he had bought her. He had never been her owner, not for a single moment. He had been her liberator. The land, he rasped, his eyes finding hers. The deed is in there too. It's yours. All of it. It's not much, but it's all I have left. He sank back against the thin pillow, his breath coming in shallow gasps. My wife, my boy, they're buried up on the ridge. I couldn't save them. I just wanted one good thing. One thing to leave behind that wasn't just dust and regret. The confession hung in the air, a lifetime of pain distilled into a few broken sentences. The truth of it, the sheer staggering weight of his sacrifice broke over her. This dying man, this stranger, had spent his last dollar, his last ounce of strength, not to own her, but to set her free. To give her and her unborn child a future he would never see. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, a silent, streaming torrent down her face. She knelt by his cot and took his gnarled, cold hand in both of hers. It wasn't a gesture of servitude. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking gratitude. She couldn't speak. There were no words for this. There were no words for the man who had bought her freedom and, in doing so, had given her back her own soul. He squeezed her hand weakly, a faint, peaceful smile touching his lips. He had bought a future, and now, finally, he was giving it away. The days that followed were a gentle, sorrowful vigil. Elias no longer fought the illness. He seemed to have made a quiet peace with it. His world was the cot, the window, and Sarah's presence. The roles were now so completely reversed that it felt as if they had always been this way. She was the anchor. He was the one adrift. She cared for him with a tenderness that was born not of duty, but of a deep and abiding connection that transcended words. She changed his linens, bathed his feverish brow with cool water, and read to him from the small Bible she'd found in his chest. Her voice, soft and steady, filled the quiet cabin, the ancient words of Psalms and Proverbs, a comforting balm in the face of the inevitable. He rarely spoke, conserving what little energy he had. But his eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin, a silent, grateful watchfulness. In those long, quiet hours, a new kind of conversation unfolded between them, one of shared looks and small gestures. She would adjust his pillow, and he would give a faint, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. He would watch her as she stood by the window, her hand resting on her growing belly, and a look of profound peace would settle on his features. He was not just seeing her. He was seeing the future he had secured, the continuation of life that he had been denied. One afternoon, he seemed to rally, a flicker of his old strength returning. "The ridge," he whispered, his voice thin as a thread. "I want to see the ridge." It was his final request. With great effort, she helped him sit up, then supported his frail weight as they made the slow, arduous journey to the cabin door. She brought a chair to the porch, and he sank into it. His breathing labored, but his eyes clear. He looked out at the rolling hills, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. He pointed a trembling finger toward a small rise, crowned by two simple wooden crosses under the shade of a lone, ancient oak tree. "Maria," he said, the name a soft sigh. "Daniel." He was not seeing the present. He was communing with his past, bringing the fractured pieces of his life together in these final moments. Sarah stood beside his chair, her hand resting on his shoulder, a silent guardian of his peace. They sat like that for a long time, watching as the shadows lengthened and the sky softened to dusk. "It's good land," he murmured, his eyes sweeping the horizon. "It's thirsty, but it's good. It'll be good to you." It was a blessing, a final handing over of his legacy. As twilight deepened, his breathing grew shallower, softer. His head, which had been held up with such effort, finally listed to one side, resting against the back of the chair. His hand, which had been gripping the armrest, relaxed and fell open. The constant rattling struggle in his chest ceased. There was only the sound of the evening wind and the cry of a distant nightjar. He was gone. Sarah stood there for a long time, her hand still on his shoulder, the warmth slowly fading from beneath her palm. There was no terror in the moment, no panic, only a vast, quiet sorrow and an equally vast, quiet gratitude. The ghost had finally faded, but he had not left a graveyard. He had left a sanctuary. She gently closed his eyes, then went back inside the cabin that was now hers, to light a lamp against the encroaching darkness. The world outside the window was black and uncertain, but for the first time in her life, inside her small corner of it, a steady light was burning. Months passed. The harsh, bleached landscape of winter gave way to the tentative green of spring. The change was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but it was undeniable. Small, determined wildflowers began to dot the fields, their colors a vibrant rebellion against the muted browns and grays. The creek, fed by melting snow from distant hills, ran fuller and clearer. The air itself felt different, softer, filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. The ranch, too, was changing. Under Sarah's patient and determined hand, the place was slowly shedding its skin of neglect. The vegetable garden, expanded and carefully tended, was a patchwork of thriving green shoots. The sagging porch had been reinforced with new planks, salvaged from the crumbling sections of the barn. The cabin windows were clean, and inside the space felt not empty but peaceful. It was a home. Her home. Sarah moved through her days with a new, quiet confidence. Her belly was a great, proud sphere now, the life within her a constant rolling reminder of the future that Elias had purchased. The loneliness of the place remained, a vast, ever-present ocean, but it was no longer a loneliness that threatened to drown her. It was a clean, quiet solitude that allowed her to hear her own thoughts, to feel the steady rhythm of her own heart. She had made a cautious connection with the doctor's wife in the town 20 miles away, a kind Quaker woman who had come out to the ranch after hearing of Elias's passing. She brought supplies and kindness in equal measure, her presence a thin but vital thread connecting Sarah to a world that was not entirely hostile. She was no longer just a woman like that. She was Mrs. Thorne, a widow, a landowner. A piece of paper, a simple signed document, had rewritten her identity in the eyes of the law, if not in the hearts of all men. One bright morning, as the sun crested the ridge where Elias lay at rest beside his wife and son, Sarah stood on her porch, a hand resting on her stomach, feeling the strong, tumbling kick of her child. She looked out at the land, her land, stretching out before her. She saw not a desolate wasteland, but a place of possibility, a place to put down roots, a place to build a life. The memory of the auction block, of the chains, of the dehumanizing voices was still there, a scar on her soul, but it was no longer an open wound. It was a part of the story, the dark, harrowing first chapter of a book she was now writing for herself. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of rain. It was the same wind that had once felt so hostile, so empty. Now, it felt like a whisper of encouragement. She was free. Her child would be born free. This was the legacy of the dying rancher. It wasn't in the land itself, or the cabin, or the few coins left in the wooden chest. It was in this single, breathtaking reality. A reality bought with one man's final redemptive act. A quiet hope, as resilient and determined as the wildflowers in the field, had taken root in the barren soil of her past, and it was, at long last, beginning to bloom.